All right, welcome everyone as you're coming in. I want to extend the welcome of the ALS Con Law section to you. Thank you for making time in your day to be here with us today. We are very lucky to have four incredible scholars to talk with us today. And I will begin by introducing Professor Chris Henning. Professor Henning is the Bloom Professor of Law and Director of the Juvenile Justice Clinic and Initiative at the Georgetown Law Center. A former public defender, she has published in many journals and books and edited volumes. She has received many awards, and she is a graduate of Duke University, Yale Law School, and an LLM from Georgetown. So, Professor Henning, would you like to take it away?
Absolutely. Let me just say right off the bat, thank you so much, Andrea, for pulling us together and giving us an opportunity to share our books. I'm so excited to hear from these three wonderful women on the panel with me as well. But we're going to dive right in. We got an hour with you guys. And so my book is The Rage of Innocence: How America Criminalizes Black Youth. And this book grows out of my years, my experience of representing children arrested and prosecuted for crimes in the District of Columbia. I have been representing children for 26 years. And in that entire time, I have only represented 4 white children. That's it. Every other child I've represented has been African-American, and that is an outrageous disparity. Folks who are not familiar with Washington, D.C. might be thinking, hey, there must not be any white kids in Washington, D.C. proper, or that white kids don't commit crime. We know that is not the case at all in either regard. Also, when I talk about the arrest and prosecution and detention of children, people automatically assume that I must be talking about serious violent offenses. But this also is very far from the truth. Very few young people of any race in any class are engaged in the sort of types of violent crimes that we fear most: rape, murder, felony assaults, robberies. And instead, juvenile courts across the country are populated by children who have engaged in some sort of normal adolescent behavior. And so I have to say that after doing this work for 26 years and still representing kids through the clinic at Georgetown, that it becomes impossible to do this work and not want to blow up the whole system, right? But, you know, short of that, I really began to ask some of the hard questions, you know, the easiest one being, is this happening in other parts of the country? Why do these extreme racial disparities exist? How are these extreme disparities impacting children, Black children, mentally, physically, psychologically, developmentally, right? Asking whether or not this hyper-surveillance and over-criminalization of Black children is making us any safer as a country. And if these disparities aren't serving any good and they aren't justified, then what do we do about it? And so that's really what this book is about. It's a collection of stories interwoven with empirical research, data, and the law to help us think about how to grapple with, you know, how to understand and how to grapple with and address the concern about the criminalization. And so to make this come alive for you in our little sort of 10 minutes each that we have with you, let me just share a story about a girl that I write about, a girl that I represented in DC and that I write about in the book. And her name is Charisse. Charisse is a 17-year-old girl who got into an argument with her boyfriend at school. She was arguing with him in the hallway, and she was convinced that he was cheating on her. So she grabbed his cell phone and began to walk away. As she's walking away, she's scrolling through his text messages to see if he'd been texting with some other girl. A school resource officer, police officer stationed at that school, saw this incident, knew the couple, right? Knew the couple well, and decided to intervene. His intervention was to arrest her. Right? Arrest her. She was arrested in the hallway in front of her classmates, held in detention overnight, brought to court the next day, and prosecuted for robbery, which is a serious felony on the books. It's an absolutely absurd story, right? For taking the property of another by stealth and violence, right? Absolutely absurd. But it's a real sort of classic example of what I'm talking about with the criminalization of normal adolescent behaviors. Even when we get annoyed with the recklessness of adolescence, for the most part, we still treat white teenagers with tolerance, grace, compassion, forgiveness, if not downright humor, right? We allow white children the privilege, and that's what it is, the privilege of adolescence, to include physical safety, public affirmation, adventure, experimentation, and extended periods of academic and social freedom. By contrast, Black children are criminalized for virtually every aspect of their adolescence, from the clothes that they wear, the music that they listen to, the way they style their hair. I saw Wendy Green, shout out to you, on the list. Playing on a cell phone in class, having a party, experimenting with drugs and sex, all the things that kids, not just in the United States, but all over the world do. And so there are now generations of Black children who have grown up across the country under the constant surveillance of both police in a blue uniform, but also of civilians, all of us, who are playing this role in criminalizing Black children. But in terms of law enforcement, in many Black and brown neighborhoods, police are parked on the street corner. They drive through the community at all hours of the day and night, asking young people, where are you going? Where are you coming from? Asking young people to lift their shirts, right? So that the officers can see whether they have weapons or not. They're stationed at the front door of the schoolhouse, and the consequences for the health and the well-being of Black children is absolutely devastating. There's a growing body of research documenting the extraordinary psychological trauma that policing imposes on Black and brown children at one of the most important times in their developmental trajectory. Studies show that Black children who have been the target of significant stops and frisk, or who live in these heavily surveilled neighborhoods, experience high rates, or report high rates of fear, anxiety, depression, hopelessness. They become hypervigilant, meaning that they're always on guard, and that they're and they're distrusting of police officers. And what's so tragic is that distrust of police officers transfers over to other state actors. What's so powerful about this research is that it shows that trauma occurs not just by being the direct target of these kinds of encounters, but also from witnessing or hearing about them involving friends or family, or even people we do not know. There's powerful research on what they call traumatic events online, watching the killing of George Floyd on the internet or television. We all know how we felt as adults, as lawyers, as constitutional law scholars, but think about what it must be like to be a teenager, a Black teenager who knows that this could happen to me as well. So then what does all of this mean when we think about sort of the fundamental rights and protections guaranteed by the Constitution? I think immediately about developmental equity and equal protection. I think about substantive and procedural due process, including, the liberty interest protected by the Fourth Amendment. I think about the impact of racial trauma on that interrogation context. and the Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. I think about the Eighth Amendment, cruel and unusual punishment. I think about the First Amendment right to free speech for all of those young people who are speaking out, against the police, both in formal ways, but think about it also in all of the informal ways in which children, assert themselves, right? Assert their humanity, their dignity, their self-worth, and they resist those labels. So I could pull the thread on any one of these sort of constitutional principles, but let me just give one example. And it is this, it's that most people, most of us, even on this call, take it for granted that we can walk through our neighborhoods, right, without undue intrusion by the police. But that is just simply not the case for so many Black children all over the country. And the research on the traumatic effects of policing really helps us understand how contemporary policing practices have eroded that fundamental right to liberty, privacy, and the right just to be kids. And so let me end with a final example, and that is this. It's a client that I write about named Andre in the book as well. And so Andre was a 15-year-old boy, Black boy, walking down the street with a friend. There was, at the time he's walking, there's no report of crime. The boys weren't doing anything out of the ordinary, not laughing, not talking, not roughhousing, and not smoking, not drinking, but the police officers rolled up next to them in a police car, rolled down their window and said, "Hey, did you hear any gunshots?" The boys said no, they kept on walking. And then the officers continued to follow them, still not satisfied. They say, "Can you lift your shirt?" The officers just wanted the boys to lift their shirt to see whether or not they had any weapons. The boys lifted their shirt, officers didn't see anything. Boys keep on walking. What happens? Police still not satisfied, continue to follow them and then say to them, "Can I search you?" At which point, both of the boys say yes. The police, 4 officers, jump out of the car, push the boys against the wall and frisk them. And, as a defense attorney, I am always baffled by anybody who says yes to a police search, right? And so we asked him, why did you say yes, to this search? And, our client said to us, wouldn't you? Right? Because if we had said no, they would have frisked us anyway. And if we had tried to run, they would have shot us in the back. And that's just such a profound sort of demonstration of how it is that no reasonable child, no reasonable Black child would ever feel free to decline a request by the police officers. And so this is what I mean by the absolute undermining. This is just one of many examples, but the undermining of the fundamental right to liberty and privacy and to just be a kid. And so that's really what the Rage of Innocence is. It's this interweaving of the stories about so many Black children criminalized, hyper surveilled, and over policed. And the book, offers up a way forward, a way for us as a country to think about how can we learn to treat Black children like children too. So The Rage of Innocence, How America Criminalizes Black Youth.
Thank you so much. That's so powerful, and your book is incredible. I will next go to Professor Dorothy Roberts. And Professor Roberts is the George A. Weiss University Professor of Law and Sociology at the Raymond Pace and Sadie Tanner Moselle Alexander Professor and of Civil Rights. This title is so long. At the University of Pennsylvania Carey Law School with joint appointments in Africana Studies and Sociology. She is the author of Fatal Invention, Shattered Bonds, Killing the Black Body, more than 100 articles and book chapters. She has edited 6 books. She has received so many scholarships, awards, and grants. I could spend the rest of our session here just talking about how amazing she is, but I will hand it over to Professor Roberts.
Great, thank you so much. And it's just great to rejoin this group to talk about our books that are so related to each other. I'm just honored to be among you all and share these little tidbits about our books. And I'm glad that I could go after Chris's wonderful story about her book, because I think it follows so well my book, Torn Apart: How the Child Welfare System Destroys Black Families and How Abolition Can Build a Safer World. Both of our books intersect about the devaluation of Black children and how the state has established this carceral web that entangles them, and the need to dismantle these systems in order to value Black children and their families. Let's see here. Okay, I'll start with a story that some of you may have heard about that I tell in my book, and that's what happened to Saisha Mercado and her family one day in Florida in August of last year, when their family was surrounded by sheriffs from the Manatee County, Florida Sheriff's Department, and with guns drawn, ordered them to leave their car. Ms. Mercado was in the car with her newborn baby, only 10 days old, and the sheriffs demanded that she turn her baby, who was still breastfeeding, over to caseworkers from the Child Welfare Department. Now, they got entangled in this mess because Ms. Mercado, when she was pregnant with the baby, brought their toddler to the hospital in St. Petersburg, Florida, to get some care. She was concerned that he wasn't transitioning to solid foods from breastfeeding very easily, and she was concerned that maybe he was dehydrated. Instead of helping the family, they took custody of their toddler and held him after calling the child welfare authorities, who charged the family with failure to thrive and medical neglect of their son, even though they had brought him to the hospital to get medical care. That then put the family on the radar of Child Protective Services and made her baby be alleged to be at risk simply because her son had been put in the custody of the state. And so a judge issued a pickup order to demand that she turn over her baby. It took 9 more days to get the baby back and longer to get their son back. And that was only because her partner had video streamed on Instagram what happened, and there was an outcry against it. But this reflects what happens to Black families every day. The brutal taking of their children based on allegations mostly of child neglect, which is almost always associated with poverty or just the needs that a family has to take care of their children. And this is the way they're often treated, with entanglements with the law enforcement. I got interested in this topic when I was working on my book, Killing the Black Body, which was published in 1997. And I was investigating the prosecutions of Black women who used drugs and were pregnant. And at the time, in the late 1980s, there began this campaign, excuse me, of punishing Black women for being pregnant while using drugs, turning a public health issue into a crime. And I discovered that while hundreds of Black women were being arrested, there were thousands upon thousands of Black mothers whose newborn babies were being taken from them on grounds that they abused them while pregnant. And this got me interested in the child welfare system. And I immediately learned, it doesn't take long to learn this, that Black children at the time, around the year 2000, were the largest group of children, excuse me, in foster care, and that they were 4 times as likely as white children to be taken from their families. I then wrote a book published in 2001 called Shattered Bonds: The Color of Child Welfare, just to document the blatant racism in this system and to make the case that this is a form of racial oppression. 20 years later, I was called on to write a preface for a 20th anniversary edition to Shattered Bonds, and I decided to write a whole new book that made a stronger case for abolishing the so-called child welfare system and arguing that it's actually a family policing system that targets Black communities for disruption. And I came to that because in the intervening 20 years, I spent a lot of time working on reform efforts to try to reform the child welfare system, including spending 9 years as an expert in Washington state as a result of a class action lawsuit that proved that the state of Washington was violating the constitutional rights of children in foster care in that state. And part of the settlement was to bring 5 national experts to figure out how to fix it. I was one of those, and we spent 9 years trying to fix it, and believe me, we did not fix it. I also got involved in the prison abolition movement, and so began to understand the principles of abolition and the importance of abolishing systems, dismantling them and replacing them when they are shown to be designed to oppress Black people and in other ways support racial capitalism. And I also got to know activists who were beginning to form a movement to abolish the family policing system. So in Torn Apart, I document the continuing gross disparities, racial disparities in the removal of children from their homes. Native children and Black children are the most likely of any children in America to experience family separation. And as this study concluded, it's common in the US for Black and Native children to be placed in foster care. Also, another recent study found that more than half of Black children in America will experience a child welfare investigation by the time they reach age 18. So being involved with this disruptive system and harmful system is common. It's not just common, it's the most common experience for Black children. And this is something that also distinguishes the relationship between this system and white people in America and Black people in America, because Black children in America all have some experience, whether they've been the subject of an investigation or even placed in foster care, or they have relatives, they have classmates, they have friends, they have neighbors. Virtually every Black child will have some connection to this system. And so it's not a system that is malfunctioned, and that's why we see headlines about missed children. We should see more headlines about children who are wrongfully taken from their families. But just to explain a couple of these images here, one is of child welfare investigators in Arizona who put on t-shirts saying professional kidnappers, which is exactly how the families I've spoken with think about this system. And another poster put up by Joyce McMillan in New York City, who is an abolitionist there. They separate children at the Harlem border too, pointing out that the well-documented traumas to children are being taken from their families, which were highlighted when the Trump administration was intensifying its family separation policy at the border. Those traumas occur in Black families all the time because of the high rates of investigation and of family separation in Black neighborhoods. I also point out that it's not an accident that Indigenous and Black children are the most likely to be taken from their families. These are the same communities that have been targeted by the US government for child removal as a form of oppression since the beginning of this nation. And of course, Black children were under the complete authority of white enslavers during the institution of slavery. Black families were separated frequently. And after emancipation, Black children were separated from their families and put back in the custody of former white enslavers through the so-called apprenticeship system, where judges ordered that Black children be put back in custody as apprentices with white supervisors on grounds that their families were neglecting them, and Native children, beginning with the Indian Wars, so-called Indian Wars in the 1800s, were taken from their families as a weapon of war, a deliberate weapon of war. And of course, that policy continued into the 1970s of taking Indian children through the child welfare system now on grounds that their families neglected them, and placing them in boarding schools and up for adoption with white families. This is a system that is structured to impede care, not to improve care for children, because it threatens families with child removal instead of actually dealing with the needs of families. It is a substitute for dealing with the needs of families, and it operates by investigating families, accusing them of child neglect mostly. Those are the main grounds on which children are taken, but also through mandated reporters who are told that they should report suspected child abuse, on my next slide, sorry, suspected child abuse to Child Protective Services, at turning the very people who are supposed to be providing support for families, teachers, doctors, social service providers, into agents for the state. And instead of providing care, deterring families from seeking support from these professionals. And it's well documented that these professionals are highly racially biased in their reports, far more likely to suspect Black parents of abusing their children and to report them to authorities than they are white families whose children have very similar injuries. And also the system, because it's designed only to respond to the needs of impoverished families, also for that reason is more likely to target Black families. I also highlight in Torn Apart,
Professor Roberts,
yeah.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but let's save the rest of this for the Q&A so we can move on.
Okay, I'm
Okay.
sorry. I thought
No, it's
okay.
It's fascinating. I could listen to you talk all day, but I want to make sure everybody gets it. So I'm going to move on to.
Let me.
Okay, go ahead.
Oh, okay.
Okay, perfect. I'm now going to introduce Professor Cheryl Cashin, who is the Carmack Waterhouse Professor of Law, Civil Rights, and Social Justice at Georgetown Law Center. She doesn't want me to talk too much about her. She has amazing books: Loving Place Not Race, The Failures of Integration, and The Agitator's Daughter. She clerked for Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall. She's won so many awards, and she's amazing. We're so lucky to have her here. So please, Professor Cashin. Unmute.
Hello. It's just breathtaking to come after these two wonderful women, Chris and Dorothy. And I have to say, as the mother of twin 15-year-olds, very devastating. But I think you're going to see the intersection between my presentation and the two previous ones. I would say that this system of systemic residential segregation, which I'm going to talk about, helps facilitate this kind of predatory surveillance of Black people and Black children that you've just heard about. So there's the segue. I'm going to share my screen. Can you see it? Can you? Okay. So white space, Black hood, opportunity hoarding, and segregation in the age of inequality. This book is my 5th book and the culmination of 2 decades of obsession with why is it that America has such dramatic, systemic concentration of advantage and disadvantage along lines of race and class. Okay, so I'm going to stick to my 10 minutes. Let me just quickly go through it. I'm going to start with a visual. What you're seeing is Minneapolis. On the left is one green dot is 100 Black people. On the right, one red dot is 10 poor people. And the black star is where George Floyd was assassinated. And you can see affluent majority white space right up against concentrated Black poverty. And the policing, the type of policing, policing is not even the right word, but the brutal predation that you saw in the video of George Floyd is of a piece with a kind of militant, predatory, violent policing visiting on Black people in majority Black neighborhoods that would not be tolerated in affluent white space. It's part of the system of residential caste that I'm about to talk about. Another visual for you, this is Buffalo, and we all know about this terrible mass shooting at a grocery store in Buffalo in the spring. 85% of Black Americans in Buffalo live on the east side, and there's only one supermarket on the east side. So that kind of entrenched, concentrated Blackness made it easier for a predatory domestic terrorist to identify a neighborhood in which he could go on a shooting spree and kill a lot of Black people in an instant. Now, the overarching message of my book is that each time this country seemed to have put to bed a peculiar Black subordinating institution, it created another one. All of them were justified. The politics and the gathering of public support for the institution was based on a propaganda of nasty Black stereotypes. The stereotypes have metastasized over time, and so have the forms of social control, from slavery to Jim Crow to the iconic Black ghetto, right? And the concentrated Black poverty was intentionally constructed in part. Well, it was the main and dominant response to 6 million Black people moving, beginning in the 1910s, moving to escape violence, Jim Crow, moving north and west. Wherever Black people landed in large numbers, they were intentionally constrained into their own neighborhoods through restrictive covenants, through violence, through zoning. And then those neighborhoods were redlined and cut off from the type of enormous public and private investment that was rained down on Black neighborhoods, creating an enormous wealth gap. I don't have time to go into this history of the construction and maintenance of hyper-segregated Black neighborhoods. Some of this will be quite familiar to you, but what I want to underscore is the role of law in this, right? There would be an anti-Black stereotype that's part of the politics to adopting these laws. The laws would be adopted, and then private individuals, Dorothy and I believe it was Dorothy used the term racial capitalism, but private individuals who weren't at the top of the capitalist structure, who couldn't afford, who aren't elites, would get conscripted into supporting these institutions, these systemic anti-Black practices. I'm not going to go through it, but the big message of my book is that we have a system of residential caste that is animated by present, current, ongoing anti-Black processes. This is not the past. This is not 1910s. This is today, right? The government overinvests and excludes in affluent white space and disinvests and contains and frankly preys upon people in high poverty Black space through processes. We at all levels, most governments actually invest in segregation rather than resist it. All right. Opportunity hoarding, which I'll talk about specifically in a minute. This is, but I'll give you a stat that speaks to it, right? I have my first chapter is a case study of Baltimore that goes through all of this history from the late 19th century through to today. But even in a post-civil rights city, a majority Black city that has had majority Black representation on the city council, and most of the mayors, the last 7 or 8 mayors have been Black. They found, a academic who really studied the data revealed to the city's horror that they were spending 4 times as much in white neighborhoods as Black neighborhoods for the kinds of community investment that makes life good, right? And then there's surveillance, which I don't have to repeat this because our previous 2 presenters speak to it, but everybody who's just watched the videos, right? There's a system of public and private surveillance of people in the hood, but it bleeds over to any Black body that's found in a situation where someone feels uncomfortable with them being there, right? But that's born of, and it's reflected in the 2 previous presentations. All of this is born of applying a lens of ugliness and stereotype to Black people, presumed thug rather than presumed citizen. Okay, now I'm just gonna quickly give you a few more visuals. People like to think about the iconic Black ghetto. I use that as a descriptor, not a pejorative. The iconic Black hood as something of the past, but it actually has persisted, and concentrated poverty actually, particularly since the 2000s, the footprint of it has expanding, right? This is hyper-segregated Baltimore. Green is Black, East and West Baltimore. These were the areas where Black people were contained in the 1910s. These were the areas that were redlined. These were the areas that were subjected to the cumulative brunt force trauma of urban renewal and highways that were intentionally torn through Black neighborhoods. All of the major development policies of the 20th century that helped construct advantaged suburban white space were done at the expense of Black places. But even today, the most recent story of virulent, ugly opportunity hoarding. This is the red line. I'll just say really, really quickly. Been on the books since 1965. The poorest neighborhoods of Baltimore, you can't get light rail that gets you easily to the job centers downtown or in the suburbs. They finally were going to build it with a infusion of millions of dollars from the Obama administration, and the Republican governor Larry Hogan rescinded it within months of coming into office, and reallocated 100% of the money for this planned light rail to outlying majority white areas and road projects. That's opportunity hoarding. This is Houston. The pale area is majority white space. The blue stars are housing projects, right? The yellow stars are low-income housing tax credit projects. Government has been paying to concentrate poverty, not just in Houston, but everywhere in communities that already have their fair share of low-income housing. And this reifies affluent white space. The people here went apeshit, frankly, when a proposed mixed income development was going to be in an affluent area, and the Black mayor acquiesced and killed the project. Chicago, a tale of 2 cities. This is all red, very low income people, all blue, very high income people in direct horizontal competition for limited resources. What do the people on the South and West Side get? They get aggressive policing, incarceration, and waves of school closures. Over here, they get 4 times as much money for public investment. This is a system of residential caste. And the beauty, once you understand these systemic processes and see geography at the intersection of race and class as a caste system, the way forward is clear. We need abolition and repair. We need disruption, abolition of this system. We need inclusion rather than exclusion. We need racial equity in investing rather than opportunity hoarding. And I'll leave it to the experts about how we disrupt and end surveillance. Last thing I'll say is at least Black folks have allies. We have to be organized. There's a lot of local innovation going on, and I'll stop there. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And a wonderful segue into our next speaker, Derica Purnell. And the introduction has disappeared from my screen, but she is a human rights lawyer, a scholar in residence at Columbia Law School, and I will let her tell us about her incredible book. Except I'm not seeing her on the screen right now. Okay. Well, we'll pause. Well, hopefully she will be able to come back, and I will take right now any questions that people want to ask. Okay, I'll start. Since we're in a constitutional law webinar, I did want to ask if you felt like there are any constitutional solutions or ways of thinking about and framing the problem that would be helpful as we think about all the solutions that, you know, Professor Cashin, you just kind of threw out a lot of things we need to think about, which is amazing, but I'm just wondering if anyone wants to think about how those constitutional principles, if not actual analysis as it exists right now in the current court, would be helpful.
If I could just quickly flag, I didn't get to it, the parts of the Constitution that are implicated by my presentation. Clearly, the Equal Protection Clause, right? The Due Process Clause, eminent domain as well. But you know, Brown v. Board was decided a long time ago, and I feel like Black people aren't even getting what Plessy, separate and equal, promised. What we have is separate and virulently unequal. And frankly, we have a Supreme Court that has been hostile, with the exception of the Warren Court, to giving real protection, equal protection to Black Americans, right? So I don't expect great things from the currently constructed Roberts Court. So right now, I think is a time to be shining a light on this. But I think we would have to have a very different court to use constitutional litigation to get anything different.
Yeah. Any other thoughts? And Derica is trying to come back in on her phone because her power is out.
Oh, wow. Well, just quickly, I could say I agree with what Cheryl said about the Roberts Court, really the right-wing Kavanaugh and et al. Court. Roberts doesn't even have control over it. He's middle of the road compared to the others. It's difficult to see how we would make any gains in terms of racial justice, let alone abolition, under this court. But that doesn't mean that constitutional principles don't apply to our activism and to other venues that we could advocate in. And I think that the Reconstruction Amendments, as I happen to have written an article called Abolition Constitutionalism, the foreword to the Harvard Law Review Supreme Court issue a couple of years ago, advocating for an abolitionist construction of the 13th and 14th Amendments, which can be useful for framing our activism certainly protection of family autonomy. The very first cases interpreting the 14th Amendment as supporting substantive due process had to do with parental autonomy. And we know that the abolitionist vision that animated the 13th and 14th Amendments focused on the freedom of Black families to be able to keep together, and Black parents and other family caregivers to have authority over the care of their children, and not white supremacists and the state. And then there's also the just enforcing the Fourth Amendment. I didn't have a chance to say this, but the Fourth Amendment is rarely enforced when it comes to families. Caseworkers and police officers routinely force their way through threats into families' homes to investigate without ever even thinking about getting a warrant, with ever seeing a judge. They just threaten that we're going to take your children away if you don't let us in. And the same way that Chris was talking about, why do Black teenagers turn over information to the police? It's out of fear. And this fear is rampant in Black neighborhoods, the fear that your children are going to be taken from you. And so one of the strategies that abolitionists in New York City and other places are using is to get legislation to enforce the Fourth Amendment. It's just one step, but giving families greater enforcement of their constitutional rights, which exist already, that just aren't enforced, is just one way we can chip away at the power of this extremely powerful state apparatus that has the ability to take children away without reason.
So, I will add, everything that has been said by Cheryl and Dorothy is spot on. I think about in the delinquency and criminal context, the great gains before the current court, but the great gains, made around Eighth Amendment jurisprudence, what is considered cruel and unusual punishment for children, in light of, Roper versus Simmons, carrying all the way through, JDB versus North Carolina, the Supreme Court recognition that children are different. And so I highlight that only to say that there was a time in which we thought as advocates that it was absolutely insanity, or I shouldn't say we thought it was insanity, the courts thought it was insanity for us as advocates to come in and talk about adolescent brain development in the context of a constitutional argument, or in the context of a juvenile or criminal case. And now it's precedential, right? That adolescent development is relevant. I say all of that to say that a number of us have been using JDB versus North Carolina, which is the Supreme Court case, saying that it is that age is relevant in the calculus of whether or not a child was in custody for purposes of the Fifth Amendment. Really seminal case, because it becomes the bridge for all the other sort of constitutional questions involving children in the criminal justice space. Obviously Fourth Amendment, obviously being the most obvious one. And so, and then also in sentencing, all of this showing that children, that the difference between adolescence and adulthood is relevant. But that a number of us have now moved beyond that question, right, of adolescent development, to think about the intersection of race and adolescence. What does it mean to be a reasonable child? What does it mean to be a reasonable Black child in all of these questions? And I agree with Cheryl. We're not getting anywhere at the Supreme Court level on that question this year. However, or anytime, in the near future. However, I will say at the state Supreme Court level, thinking about where do we push the envelope on some of these questions, these, state constitutional questions. So I just, I sort of throw that out. We've got, Commonwealth versus Warren, the first state Supreme Court to say that flight is no longer consciousness of guilt, in a criminal case. And when you think about reasonable articulable suspicion. So I just wanted to throw that out as well.
That's great. Thank you so much. We have Derica back. So Derica, can you give us a shortened version of your talk? We would really love to hear about your book.
Oh, no, it's okay. The flow has been so amazing. I was really enjoying it, and I'm on my phone. I don't feel super comfortable doing that. But I don't know what's going on. It's barely raining. And so it's just so random and so weird. But thank you all for your flexibility and inviting me to contribute. So you just briefly say that last year I published a book called Becoming Abolitionist, Police Protests in the Pursuit of Freedom. It's a book that is sort of responsive to all of the uprisings that happened in 2020 in the wake of the police killings of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. But it had been a book that had been in the making for several years before, where I had been thinking about questions of abolition and violence particularly. And so the book sort of charts out how a generation who had been calling for George Zimmerman's arrest in 2012 for the killing of Trayvon Martin, how did this generation become a generation who ultimately became to embrace abolitionist politics, a politic where they, is committed to eradicating the prison industrial complex, a politic that interrogates questions of, across race, across class, across gender identity, and really see police as a force that's responsive to maintaining lines of inequality. And so the book sort of charts that out for my sort of political journey, because I'm a part of that generation. And then it uses journalism and historical research and critical sociology and the law to really put that journey into context. And so the first part of the book, I think the first chapter is really about my personal journey. And then the second chapter is about the history of police, not necessarily as coming out of slave patrols, but also just thinking about them and their evolution as being response to people's will and determination to be free. So it starts with freedom and not necessarily started with slavery. Chapter 3 takes on some very, very popular reforms, from body cameras to diversity, and really thinks critically about how these efforts have been put on the table to alleviate police violence. When now we're seeing reforms more than ever, we're seeing more cop convictions than ever, but we're also seeing the number of police killings not only continue, but increase as of this year. Chapter 4 brings in abolition, and particularly through the ways that the conversation around abolition became popular on student campuses during student movements from the United States to Brazil to South Africa and the Netherlands. And then chapter 5 and 6 look more like the original idea of the book, as both of those chapters takes on violence. One big question that abolition is getting, what about the murderers? What about the rapists? What's going to happen if we abolish the police, if we close 2,300 jails and prisons, if we fire 1 million cops and, abandon 18,000 law enforcement agencies? And so what it does in those chapters is sort of demystify what we consider violent crimes, violent behavior, and really explain how police don't necessarily prevent these things. If anything, they help to perpetuate them or concentrate them in places like prisons. And then 7 and 8 put abolition into conversation with disability justice and the fight to protect our planet. I discuss how historically and today police have been a primary response to migration. And so when there is a hurricane or a natural disaster, I talk about Hurricane Katrina, I talk about forest fires. I explain how different state governments or federal governments use police as a mechanism to essentially stop flight from poor people, from dark peoples who are trying to escape climate catastrophe and get somewhere safe, and instead use the police to create barriers to protect different forms of property to people who can afford it. And those people obviously tend to be richer and tend to be whiter. And so that is sort of the quickest overview of the book I've ever given my entire life on my iPhone in the dark. And so thank you again for allowing me to do this. And hopefully I'll be able to share more in a less rushed context.
Well, we appreciate you. Thank you for persisting. And that's, I mean, it's really a wonderful contribution that you're making, even in the dark and even that quickly. That's excellent. Okay, so we have 2 minutes left. I could just take a quick comment or question. Okay, well, this will be available on the ALS Con Law section website. So please spread the word to everyone who wasn't able to make it before, but I think this was an incredible session. I'm so grateful to these scholars, these authors. You are inspiring. Thank you so much for sharing your time and your books with us. And I hope to see everybody at ALS. We may have some future events coming up before the meeting, but I hope to see you all there. So thank you again.